me tell you a little bit about my rise in my career as a pollster. I was literally born to poll, I think. It's in my DNA. When I was 5 years old, I had a family nickname that I didn't care for, and I couldn't really seem to get rid of it. So I went around the neighborhood one afternoon, and I talked to my friends' mothers, and I think my very leading question was, don't you think this would be a good name for a witch? Now, I didn't have a questionnaire, and I didn't write anything down, and I didn't draw a random sample, and I didn't tabulate data, but I did report the findings, and my mother found them credible, and the name went away. So that was a very powerful experience, and one that I think I drew on as I went to college and I found myself sparking to the social sciences to find out, to gather data about what people think, why they think that, how they came to believe what they believe. Are there opportunities for them to change? What would influence their opinion to think otherwise? And that's kind of how I've grown my career, to look at what matters for our nation, what matters for our state, our counties, our school districts, for our memberships of organizations, for voters, generally speaking, the electorate at large, nonprofits, causes, those kinds of things. Now, I know a little bit about the history of George Gallup, but I've never found in any of the history a description of the moment where this aha moment of inventing the idea of public opinion polling. But I have a fantasy about it. And that spawns from spending a lot of time in advanced statistics class where they teach you 7,000 ways to estimate crop yields so that you can change how you're tending the crops, how you're planting them, what you're doing with irrigation, and then determine what your best methods are. And statistically, you don't have to wait for that hard moment at harvest when you know exactly what your yield per acre was. You can figure it out in advance, not by counting every ear of corn on every stalk, in every row, on every acre, but counting a representative sample, a method that gives every ear of corn an equal chance to be counted in your estimate of how you're going to go. And I have this idea that George Gallup, sort of in Iowa City, looked out the window, saw a cornfield, and said, well, you know, if we can do it with corn, can we do it with votes? Can we draw a random sample of voters and get an estimate before the election of what's going to happen? There would certainly be a hard moment in time, a real event, to know whether that could or could not happen. So that's my little fantasy about how it came to be. And you know, we're still probably today using a lot of the questions that George Gallup invented. Do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? Do you have favorable or unfavorable impressions? If the election were held today, who would you vote for? Now, we don't have to just ask those questions. We don't have to limit it just to election polling. I've been involved with the Des Moines Register's Iowa poll since 1988, and we took a look at what I like to call the soft underbelly of the Iowa Psyche, thinking that was as important a role for the poll as anything else. And just here's a few quick findings that I thought were kind of fun. We know how many Iowans own a pair of bib overalls. People might think that's low. We know how many people think they personally will be going to hell, and how far more think their neighbor will be going to hell. We know how many say they've mastered the hokey pokey. That seems low to me, too. We know how many have named their cars, tend to be B names, Betsy, Beulah, and so on. And we know how many say they would marry their spouse again, and how many are rethinking the whole proposition. And I guess if the science of random sampling is that science part, what we ask is the art part. And we can do some quirky things in terms of how we ask, and that's kind of part of the fun of it. But there are quirks that sometimes show up in our data that at the moment they're happening are not all that fun. And I want to talk you through 3 examples of that from this election season, things that I was up against in working with my clients. The first is Colorado. We worked with the University of Denver to launch their first public opinion poll. They hosted the first presidential debate. We gathered the data, we look at the findings, and there's sort of a reverse gender gap happening in the data. Gender gap means women are more inclined to vote Democratic by wider margins than are men. And in Colorado, our data showed women tied between Romney and Obama, and men actually favoring Obama by a several-point margin. So here are neophyte political scientists looking at these data. This is the first time they've ever had to talk to the media about the poll. Do we have a flaw? What shall we do about it? Should we fix it? And I had to have, kind of a hand-holding moment to say, look, in every poll, there's going to be something quirky under the surface. This looks like not what we would expect. We don't expect the gender gap to work that way. But there's a moral hazard in getting your grubby fingers on your data and start making it look the way you think it should look. Where do you stop? Because if you change this here, it's going to affect something over here. And pretty soon your data looks more like you than it does like the electorate. So I said, just sit tight and let's see what happens. Well, what happens is we had that hard moment, that harvest, where we could see how the vote actually turned out. And in all of the swing states, you can see the gender gap playing out on that chart right there. The pink is the margin for women voting, and you see they're all on the Obama side of the graph. The blue is the margin for men. That means they were all voting for Romney in those varying degrees. And Colorado was males, a bigger margin for Obama than females. So the University of Denver saw it first. At the moment they first saw it, they didn't think that was all that special. But once they got to Election Day, they thought it was. Married mothers is a group that I want to talk to you next. I work with Bloomberg News to do national polling and some international polling with them as well. And we had landed on married mothers with children as a potential swing group that could be the canary in the coal mine. So we took a look in Virginia and we took a look at Ohio and said, what's going to happen here, and does that predict the election? You've heard this group referred to as Kmart moms or Walmart moms or soccer moms. They get various other names, but married mothers with children we thought were interesting to take a look at. Well, our survey came back and showed that there was a 5 or 6 point margin in favor of Romney among this group. And this was at a time when everything was looking pretty close, everything was pretty much on the line. The gut instinct of my client was Romney was not going to win these states. And they were very worried about whether they should put their name on it and publish it and put it out there. And so there were some conversations about, well, here's that moral hazard. What are you going to do about it? We don't know what is going to happen in the future. So the best you can do is trust your data and put it out there, which they did. And you can see, here's what our poll showed. Again, that's the margin in favor of Romney in Ohio and Virginia, very similar. And here's what the exit polls showed. Well, a wider margin in Virginia, it's about the same in Ohio, and overall 3% nationally, which was what would make you think they're a swing group. But Obama won Ohio, and Obama won in Virginia. So to the extent that the reality was they didn't turn out to be the canary in the coal mine, and that was the assumption that they had made. Our data came back reflecting pretty much exactly what was going to happen. And there's really something interesting lurking here, which is what's happening not in the gender gap, but in the marriage gap. The exit polls show us that married people, whether you are male or female, tended to vote in higher proportions for Mitt Romney, and single people, male and female, tended to vote for Barack Obama. So when people talk about the gender gap, it really is a lot more complicated than that. And here's one of the polls that is going to help us reveal it, and reveal something about society. I mean, what is going on with marriage? What's happening there? Or what's going on with the people who choose to marry? What can we learn about ourselves and how that affects our politics? This gives us a real opportunity to see a new trend rising and dig in there and get to know ourselves a little bit more. My final example is right here in Iowa. And our pre-election poll showed a quirk that truly puzzled me. And I took it to the editor and reporters on the day that we delivered data and said, look, I'm not sure exactly what to make of it. You'll see it in the data, so I'm going to tell you about it first. And please know that this is what we're seeing. We're seeing first, number one, that among Catholic voters in Iowa, more of them are preferring Mitt Romney than are preferring Barack Obama. And among Protestant voters in Iowa, more of them are preferring Mitt Romney than are preferring Barack Obama. That accounts for 88% of the Iowa electorate. Our top line, as you recall what Deborah said in my introduction, is our poll showed Obama winning by 5 percentage points. Well, how is that possible? Statistically, you look at that and just go, I don't know how to make sense. Well, what happens is that everybody else, the people who claim not to have a religion, perhaps the Jewish members, the Muslims, there are not very many of them in Iowa, the margin for Barack Obama was so big that it overcame the smaller margins for Mitt Romney. Now, it just isn't intuitive to think that way, and that's certainly not the way that people think about Iowa, that the reason Iowa went for Barack Obama was the people with no religion. People don't think of this as a swing group. But as you can imagine, as soon as those exit polls were out, that's the page I went to first. Let's see what we now know at harvest time about how our poll worked out. And you can see in Iowa, the margin went for Romney among Catholics. Among Protestants, the margin went for Romney. And among people with no religion, a huge margin, 53 percentage points. The numbers were 75 for Obama, 22 for Romney. It's one of the biggest margins out there, and this is a group that you will now see rising in people's interest in what's going on in the electorate. This is something that has never, I don't think, in my research, been revealed exactly this way. Well, we knew that there were more people claiming to have no religion. We have a study from the Pew Trust who takes a look at these things, and you can see that back in 1972, that number was, I think, 7%, a little hard for me to see from this angle, and that's risen to 18%. So it has more than doubled. This is a group that you are now going to see people paying attention to as a potential voting bloc. And here in Iowa is a state that we saw where it actually swung the election. But it was certainly a quirk. And you can imagine that there's pressure to say there must be something wrong in our data. This isn't the way we understand Iowa to be. But it is going to be something as people begin to look forward and start preparing for the future. And that's already started. I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago talking with some other pollsters who were reflecting on what happened. And the key thing in the room that really to me is most revealing is a lot of talk about the likely voter model. What model were they using? What assumptions were they making? And very simplistically, I say I don't have one. But a lot of polling operations have a very fancy algorithm, and they'll take a look at past data and they'll use it to drive forward and say, we expect the electorate to look like this racially, we expect it to look like this by age, we expect the party breakdown to look like this, and many of those pollsters got it wrong. So it's something that has caused a ruckus for me. Probably the biggest ruckus in my career was in 2008, ahead of the Iowa caucuses. Our poll said in the Democratic caucus, 60% of the people who show up would be first-time attendees. 60%, the majority of people who are going to go to caucus, that would be their first caucus. And there was uproar about this, and a prominent member of the Clinton campaign called me to say, I have knocked on 99 doors, I don't see this happening out there, I've always trusted you until now. I said, well, tell me the doors you've knocked on. Former caucus attenders, registered Democrats. So they'd quite literally blinded themselves in their data from seeing what I was seeing in my data, where I try to get out of the way of my data, keep my grubby hands off of it. So I take a look and take pride in the fact that it's probably one of the hardest things you can do is to keep your hands off your data. But often it ends up working out. Now, I want to close with talking about why polls matter and why this matters to you. Properly done, polls give us a reflection of what's happening today and a prediction of what will happen tomorrow. And I want you to think about it. It would be almost impossible to know what's happening in a campaign if you didn't have polls to help guide you that way. Last week ago, there was an article in the Des Moines Register showing a couple of things I thought were interesting. The first one showed the amount of spending on advertising that was done in the final weeks of the campaign. And if you looked only at that, you would say, well, Romney must be leading in Iowa. There's where the money is. That's a huge marginal difference. That's the way I will understand what's happening in this campaign. And next to it was another chart showing how many field offices each of the campaigns had. Well, field offices mean voter contact. They mean there are more people out there organizing, taking people to the polls, getting the absentee ballots out there. How would you know what's happening in a campaign if you didn't have polls to help you figure that out? Here's where you come in. Polls are also something that public officials pay attention to. Their time is very limited, so the amount of time they can spend with constituents is not all that great. And they know they're hearing from the loudest, which are not necessarily giving them the most balanced view. So it seems to me that this is one of the opportunities one of the roles that polls play in democracy. That is, they give voice to the people and present them to people who care about what the people think. How else could they possibly know? How could they see what the public sees and know, if they disagreed with them, that they need to talk to them differently and communicate them and bring them to them if they want them to think the way that they think? How would they know that they're already with them and that their support is very strong? There's really no other good way to know. So while imperfect, I think polls are still one of the most effective ways you can communicate in this democracy. They act on credible data, like my mother acted on my credible data, not as a blueprint, but to help them sort of understand where the public is. That should matter to you. When you participate in credible, well-designed polls, you serve democracy. So I want to close by remembering the good idea that George Gallup had, and that we should all let our corn be counted, because your voice is like an ear of corn, and you want to be sure that it gets included when the count is done for the harvest. So let your voice rise. Thank you.